Hi, welcome to Fine Points. I'm Jeffrey Wernick, and of course, the star of Fine Points, Bruce Fine, is with me. Uh, this morning, we're going to talk about the Jack Smith files. Why do I think it's important to discuss the Smith files? There are a number of reasons. One is I certainly don't believe it's election interference. I think it kind of demonstrates a pretty strong case that the election interference that occurred was in 2020, and so I think it's important that before we vote, that there is knowledge of exactly what happened in 2020. So I think, and we also have to consider, I believe, why it's important that Smith needed to make these filings. Smith needed to make these files, in my opinion, and Bruce will have his opinions, of course, is that it became necessary when the Supreme Court made its ruling on where immunity resides and where it does not. So, of course, we expect that Trump's claims will likely be that he has immunity. Might define all this stuff as official acts, and so it was incumbent upon Smith, if he was going to proceed with the case, as he believes he has a basis for doing so, to basically demonstrate to the courts that he's complying with the Supreme Court's interpretation of what's subject to presidential immunity, what is an official act, when is evidence permitted and when is it not permitted, and so that Smith had to go through the filings given the new information that was provided by the Supreme Court in their judgment about again presidential immunity. And so they had to lay out the case and lay out the facts to the case of why their claims, and some claims that they had made previous to the ruling, they have now removed. So they've made some modification to this. So they've had to lay out in a very clear and as concise way, but as compelling way possible, to demonstrate that these were private acts done by a candidate, and they were not official acts done by a president. So to be able to delineate these charges and separate out, so there'd be not a conflation between official acts of a president and private acts of a candidate, and conversations that were a candidate speaking to his fellow candidate, his vice president, but he was speaking to him as someone who was running for office, not someone who was holding that office. So some of those conversations would be admissible into this case. That it became incumbent upon Smith to make these filings, to take into account what the Supreme Court had ruled, and given the fact that President Trump has decided to engage in dilatory tactics, so that people would never see this case. I guess the judge, Tanya Chutkin, felt that really that this should be presented to the public, and I believe it should be presented to the public, because this is also a civics lesson. If not, we would never get the civics lessons associated with under what conditions can a president be have immunity and not have immunity? When can they be charged with a crime and when not with a crime, and where the boundaries exist? And so this case is providing a public service, in the senses that the Supreme Court defined some parameters, and now we're going to get to see the application of those parameters in real life. And it's incumbent that a precedent is set and established on when is a president subject to being charged with a crime, and when they have immunity. When are they a private actor or a public official engaging in official acts? So I think it's really, really important, the case presented here, so there's clarity not only for this generation but for future generations on what exactly is meant by the boundaries of presidential immunity. Bruce, what do you think about that?
Well, let me give a little bit of background here. if I can, Jeffrey.
Sure.
One, it was a 165-page filing. Um, there were many redactions of the names of the parties' co-conspirators or witnesses, some to protect them from potential retaliation. But first, with regard to timing, the major reason why this decision is being made so close to the balloting is because at every turn, Trump's attorneys have tried to delay the case. Delay, trying at last to say you cannot have a trial until after November. What's the reason for that motivation? It's because if Trump is elected, he could probably, but he could be impeached for this, order his case be dismissed. An obvious conflict of interest, a principle of Anglo-American law for literally 5 centuries is a man can't be a judge in his own case. And if a president dismisses his own case, that's the classic example of a conflict of interest. But that's the timing issue. Now, what about the relevance? I believe it's not only a civic lesson, but because during the 2024 presidential campaign season, Mr. Trump and his vice presidential running mate, among others, including this House Speaker, Republican Mike Johnson, have been repeatedly asked, well, will you accept the outcome of the 2024 election? After all of your proper legal avenues of challenge of alleged faulty county have been resolved by courts. And they have refused to say yes. They run away from it, like it's AIDS or like it's the Black Plague. So we know that there is still a sort of Damocles hanging over the election in 2024 because they basically reserved the right to undertake a reprise of January 6th, 2021. Now, with regard to the civic lesson, I think that's very important. I believe that one of the major blunders of President Gerald Ford when he pardoned Richard Nixon, who was on the verge of indictment for obstruction of justice after he had resigned under the threat of impeachment, was that he could have let the trial go forward and then issued a pardon afterwards. But then we would at least have had the civics lesson, same what we similarly received during the Watergate impeachment hearings. And we got a glimpse of that in the House Committee's Select Committee on January 6th. That's very important for the American people to understand what's going on here, in part because on both sides you oftentimes, the rule of law is being totally distorted and misrepresented as to what's going on. At least in a judicial forum, both sides have an opportunity to argue, and the people or the jurors, if you will, can make up their minds. Now, what does the 165 pages show here? I believe that it establishes very clearly that the acts that President Trump undertook, they're not isolated, but systemic over months and months, to try to create a slate of illegal, fraudulent electors in 6 states: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Arizona. And it's laid out in this filing, was clearly intended as his status as a candidate to defraud the American people out of their entitlement to a free and fair election for the peaceful transfer of presidential power.
Can you elaborate on what made these electors fraudulent or fake electors?
Yes. Under the Constitution, state legislatures are entrusted with deciding how electors shall be elected to cast votes for the president. And under an 1887 law called the Electoral Count Act, those electors are to all meet in an electoral college and cast votes on, I think it's December 16th, preceding the following January for inauguration.
Does the president or the executive branch have any role in
no, the president has zero constitutional role in the selection of electors and in the counting of electoral votes. None whatsoever. And his attorneys kept explaining that to him numerous times, so he knew that. That is why, for example, Jeffrey, on the morning of January 6th, before Mr. Trump spoke to his supporters on the ellipse, he confronted Vice President Mike Pence, who is under the Constitution empowered to count the electoral votes that are certified by the states. He said, Mike, you need to choose between me and the Constitution, namely recognizing that there's the Constitution, which directs the vice president to count the electoral votes, or Mr. Trump that says, no, you decide if the electoral votes are legitimate or not, which clearly is the prerogative of the various states, not the vice president.
Now, what exactly did he want Pence to do? It seems to me, in reading the document, there were two possible routes. One possible route was Pence to actually accept the fake electors as real electors and basically certify the election on behalf of Trump. So, or the second was to
he wanted to send them back in these controverted states. Now, notice that he only wanted to send it back to states in cases where he lost the election. He didn't want to send it back to states where he won the election, Deb, because it's unusual to believe that if there was this massive national fraud, it would only occur in the states that Mr. Trump lost. It would be everywhere. Anyway, the second option was to send it back to the state and ask them, hey, you ought to reconsider your electoral vote because we think there's fraud and you need to investigate it. Well, they had already investigated the fraud. There had been 61 lawsuits, including administrative recounts over and over again. Every one of them, there isn't any evidence of electoral fraud that would have come close to affecting the outcome of the election. None.
Okay. Bruce, when we talk about this 165-page document that Jack Smith filed, first, to make certain things clear, the testimony he refers to. So when there's testimony cited in these documents, is that sworn testimony, or is that like a post on Twitter or True Social or somewhere else?
No. No. You put this, we take under oath. Some of it may be grand jury information, but it has to be. The number one is we need to recognize this. The 165 pages sets forth the foundations for determining immunity. But in an actual trial, you have to have the actual accusers on the witness stand to testify. You don't get a piece of paper and cross-examine a piece of paper. So these are statements that are made under oath. If you lie in this context, you're guilty of a crime under section, I think it's 371. Misleading.
So when the testimony he took that he cites, if people had provided false testimony,
that would be a crime,
subject to criminal charges.
That's correct.
Unlike a Twitter post or a True Social post,
right. That's right. Yeah.
Where nobody's swearing to that whatever they're saying is true or not true. They're exercising their free speech rights to basically tell the truth or to lie. And people can make their own judgments about whether they're being truthful or not truthful, and they're in the marketplace for reputation. Here, it's more than just a marketplace for reputation. This is a marketplace for truth, where there are consequences associated for being untruthful. That's correct?
Yes. And if I want to just elaborate a little bit, Jeffrey, you'll notice that, and we saw this in some of the testimony that was taken by the House Select Committee on January 6th, we saw some persons interrogated, like John Eastman and Julia. They invoked the Fifth Amendment, hundreds of times, meaning they said they're under oath, they can't answer because they thought it would incriminate themselves. So they understood the need, and they didn't want to answer truthfully because they thought they would have to confess they had been implicated in a crime, so they stayed silent. Now, obviously, you can't. Silence is not evidence, right? It's right. Nothing. So the people that were cited and relied upon by Jack Smith. They spoke. They didn't invoke the Fifth Amendment privilege, said this is what transpired, this is what's happened. But anyway, to go back, what he was asking, first of all, the fraudulent elector scheme never got off first base in some sense. There was an effort to transmit papers purporting to authenticate these fraudulent electors to Vice President Pence. He didn't accept them. They never got anything. He only had in his possession state-certified electoral votes that showed Mr. Biden had prevailed. And under the Electoral Count Act, there's a process by which the state, and most of it's the state governors, many of the state governors were Republican, as well as Democrats. They certified these are the valid votes from this state.
And with respect to these elector slates that were basically orchestrated, fair to say, out of the White House, right?
That is correct. It's orchestrated out of the White House, but as you pointed out,
Jeffrey, did any governor sign off on these electors?
No governor signed off on any of them. So
now with these governors where Trump had challenged the outcome of the election in these various swing states, in many cases, is it true, as presented, at least alleged to be true in these documents, that Trump or agents appointed by Trump to represent his interest as a candidate, as a private actor candidate, that there were promises made that evidence would be presented of their claims of fraud, and that in all the case that evidence was promised to be presented to state officials, that not in one case was any evidence actually presented to any state officials. Is that a fair statement of what's represented in these documents?
Yeah, and Arizona is one example, Jeffrey, where the governor said, well, you have to come up with evidence. Where is it? Rudy Giuliani, the private attorney of Mr. Trump, said, well, we have theories, but we have no evidence. But we'll get it. They kept waiting, but none of the evidence was ever forthcoming. We know that, in fact, I say, because there's 61 lawsuits trying to allege and prove that there was fraud, and every one of them failed because they are spectacularly absent of any proof of fraud. And the other thing that I think leaps out from the 165 pages is in many of the states, and again, the 6 battleground states, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia, and these are not blue states like California, that those who refused Trump's bidding were Republicans who said openly, Mr. Trump, I voted for you. I wanted you to win, but we have to follow the law and the process. They stated that was the majority of those who rejected his overture said, but I voted for you, Mr. Trump. I'm not a secret Antifa, but we have to have law obligations to the system and the process. And Mr. Trump's uniform response, well, you're weak, you're weak. You have to do the right thing. And that's why when Mr. Trump...
What does it mean about the right thing? I mean, it seems to me there's some statement that one, I guess that's kind of attributable that people think is Steve Bannon, where Steve Bannon said that Trump would basically announce that. Well, let's go back. First is there seems to be evidence, allegations provided under oath that Trump was well aware that this was going to be a very close race, and that the outcome was not going to be determined the night of the election. So that's one thing I read in the documents, is that in advance that he was told that it would take several days to figure out exactly who won because of mail-in ballots. So that he knew it would be, or at least he was told by most people around him who had commented on this, who were in a position to have knowledge about it, with respect to people who were involved in the polling and tracking everything, because their job was to work on the campaign, that this was going to be a close race. So when he went to the public and said, not only did he win big. Uh, I got to assume that when he gets an opportunity to provide exculpatory information, uh, that he'll be able to prove that he had evidence, and who provided that evidence, because it seems that what the filings have demonstrated is the fact is that the campaign and other third parties hunted for um, systemic fraud, and didn't find anything that would change the outcome of the election. So he raised about $100 million. He hired agents, people affiliated or close to him, also independently looked, and basically they came back, and one person made a comment, according to these again the files, that he he was losing all the lawsuits. I mean, some of the lawsuits he lost for lack of standing, but not all the lawsuits did he lose for lack of standing. Many lawsuits he lost because of lack of merit, not lack of standing, at least deemed by the courts as having lack of merit. And people inside, close advisors to him, also acknowledged that they were losing all these lawsuits because they were without evidence and without merit. Is that do you agree that those were the words that kind of you read in this document as well?
Uh, yes, and we need to. I make this observation, Jeffrey. There's no way that Donald Trump will ever take the witness stand. Case goes forward. He's not going to do it. He didn't do it in the New York case. No way, because he would, in my judgment, be lacerated, by cross-examination. The number of inconsistencies. But now, with regard to the facts here, yes, he was advised by these are his own people. And remember also, he had paid over $1 million after the balloting to private investigative firms to determine whether there had been any serious fraud in the balloting. They were his people that he chose to investigate. And they both came back and said there's nothing there. He's told that. Even we have J.D. Vance now, we know, before the election was saying Trump's going to lose. And that's his running mate this time around. This was not kind of, a totally surprise O. Henry ending. How could you lose? Everybody knew you were going to win. And those who were telling him that he had lost and there wasn't any evidence of fraud were not Democrats. His Attorney General, William Barr, his White House counsel, his cybersecurity chief, all of them said, you didn't win the election. Mr. Biden won the election. These claims of fraud are totally fantasy.
But even as what's been attributed to being Rudy Giuliani, who was appointed as an attorney representing his campaign to prove these allegations of fraud, it seems to me in that capacity, from what I've read in these documents, Giuliani, at least it's attributable to be Giuliani, we don't know because it's been redacted, promised to provide evidence, and they made claims of having evidence that they would provide, that they've never been able to demonstrate that they've had it, and they've never provided it to anyone.
Yes, he kept making the promises, never had anything. In fact, he confessed, we have a lot of theories, we have no evidence. Indeed, Mr. Giuliani was in a
Is a theory admissible in court as an evidence?
Just a statement is not evidence. A lawyer's argument is not evidence, right? And Mr. Giuliani was asked.
Giuliani knows the difference?
Yeah. He says he prides himself in practicing 50 years, so he presumably knew what he was talking about if he wasn't inebriated.
Trump said that he had exculpatory evidence that he can't present it because his lawyers have been telling him that to the extent that he has evidence that's 100% bulletproof exculpatory, that he should not present it until there's a trial. Now, that to me is similar to like somebody saying, I've been accused of murder, I have an alibi, but my lawyers are telling me not to tell anyone that I have an alibi, until I get to a trial. So I should wait to spend all this extra money on legal fees, and then when I get to court, that's when I present my alibi. But I don't present it so that I'm no longer a target and somebody else is a target. You're a lawyer, so
Yeah.
if a client came to you and said, I've been charged with all these things, here's all the evidence that is absolute proof that I really won, and therefore all these charges become moot because I have the evidence to back up the claims I made. So it's not a criminal conspiracy because I actually did win. And here's the evidence that I had to win, or at least here's credible evidence for me to think that I actually won, so I could say that I actually believed I won because here's the evidence that demonstrates that a reasonable person would take this evidence and believe that they won. As you as a lawyer, if I shared that with you, how would you use that evidence that could make a credible case that maybe I didn't win, but that there was enough evidence to put in doubt the outcome of whether I won or lost?
Yeah, well, if there wasn't a gag order, you'd go ahead and have a press conference immediately. And the other thing that's very
Oh,
odd
you as a
about
lawyer would not tell him you have
no, you shut up.
exculpatory evidence. Don't
No,
say anything until the trial.
not only that, Jeffrey, but Trump is notorious. He has flouted advice he got from lawyers his whole life. Why is he paying it? He does what he wants to do, irrespective of what the lawyers say. So why is this case the only one?
You doubt a lawyer actually told him that?
No lawyer ever told him that. Okay. And the reason why is because Mr. Trump has never been able to give any of that exculpatory evidence. He's had 4 months between November and January 6th, and he never was able to come up with any of this exculpatory evidence to present in court. 61 cases. So we know it's just phony. Straw on ballots that had been originated in China. I mean, these things are just out of, they're even beyond science, sci-fi.
So when he calls the people in Georgia and says, find me these votes. I
would need 11,700.
We know there's fraud. Find me these. He to paraphrase him, he pretty much said there's like 11,870 votes, more or less, and find them and then stop looking. Is that more or less what he says?
Yes, he says that. He says it one. These are Republicans.
If you're an official act, do you tell people to stop? Look for some elements of a crime, and then once you find some element of a crime, just stop looking. Don't look for the truth, and don't look beyond the scope of this. So does that sound like an official act of investigating electoral fraud, or
no,
a candidate who wants
it's
to?
Not, because remember, this is a state. The states under the Constitution, Article 2, they are entrusted with operating the electoral count at the state level. That's why we have another companion case against Trump in Georgia. He doesn't have any authority to direct a Georgia prosecutor what to do. He's talking to state officials, not federal officials in the state of Georgia. And moreover, the only case, because remember, Trump was not the only name on the ballot in 2020. The only cases that he ever was concerned about having been tainted by fraud was just his own. He never said, as a general matter, we think the entire election was corrupted, so you need to investigate the outcome of all these other races as well. The only one he ever cared about was his own, which indicates because he's the candidate, right? And he's not operating under any federal constitutional authority because this is the states that are deciding this. And the state does recounts. The state did a recount, come up with the same numbers the machines came up with. If that reinforces Jeffrey, he's acting in his capacity as a candidate, not a credible claim that there's federal constitutional authority. It might have been different if Trump gets on the phone and says, listen, I think the entire voting and balloting in November in 2020 was corrupted, and we're doing a federal investigation of all the races because we think there's been fraud using interstate commerce or something. That would be one thing. But I said it reinforces the fact that he's acting as a candidate, that the only race he ever thought was tainted was his own.
Yeah, and we also have had recently, one not so recently, but we've had the payouts by both. Recently, one was the Newsmax payout. We don't know how much was paid out, but we know how much Fox has paid out, which was almost $1 billion for getting people on and enabling people to tell falsehoods that it seems that Fox knew they were falsehoods at the time they were getting these people on to let them spread what was believed to be falsehoods, and Newsmax has decided to make a payment rather than go to trial. It seems to me if there was exculpatory evidence that they probably, I mean, if Fox paid almost $1.8 billion and something million to avoid a trial, it seems to me if they would have paid $100 million to somebody who had evidence to prove those allegations, so they would have been able to avoid paying over $800 million. Would you say it's a fair statement that they could have offered $100 million bounty to somebody to be able to prove those claims, and they would have saved $700 million, and all the subsequent people also would have saved legal fees?
Well, that's surely true.
Why do you think people continue to believe this garbage? I mean, anyone who has evidence to the contrary, anyone who has evidence that could survive being considered evidence according to the rules of evidence, it seems to me that there's been probably over $1 billion paid out because of these people making false claims, and people basically being charged with saying things that they knew to be false at the time they said it, or they enabled things to be said that they knew were false at the time they said it. Why do you think that? Why do you think that? If there was evidence out there, somebody could make hundreds of millions of dollars themselves demonstrating that evidence, yet nobody has done that. It seems to me there's a lot of money to be made showing that there really was fraud. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but I think you're right. The reason it's not forthcoming is because there isn't any evidence. To go back in terms of the money on the other side, you mentioned a couple of the cases, one against Newsmax and the other against Fox. Two of the Georgia poll workers who were defamed by Rudy Giuliani, saying that they were shown on video of tampering with the vote count. They collected $150 million judgment against Rudy Giuliani for defamation. And indeed, in the litigation, it's right down the courthouse near my offices are, Rudy Giuliani stipulated that what he said was false, that they had contaminated the vote counting. Now, why is there widespread insistence that there was fraud anyway, even knowing that it's false?
Sidney Powell also pleaded guilty.
Yeah. So
there was no Kraken. No Kraken was released because no Kraken existed.
Yeah. And Jenna Ellis is another lawyer, pleaded guilty. Another one, I forget his name, from Harvard, pleaded guilty. So you've had several guilty pleas by lawyers. Now, I believe that the MAGA people continue to say that there was fraud because, one, that's what Trump wants them to say, and they'll figure, well, Trump will do him a favor. And the other reason, in my judgment, is because they don't really have any loyalty to our process, which, like it's all human processes, are subject to error. It's win at all costs, and they'll do anything that they believe is necessary to prevail. They really, in that sense, I think, are un-American, because America is about an idea, about process, about the way in which we examine evidence, about the way in which we elect officials, about how we have judicial tribunals that give everybody an opportunity to have their evidence. And these people simply don't believe in the system. They don't believe in America. And let me elaborate just very briefly, Jeffrey. I live on Capitol Hill. In my background, it's not very far from the Capitol. And in the summer, prior to the balloting in November, I walk to my offices to and from across the Capitol Plaza. And there are at least 7 or 8 occasions where Trump supporters, the MAGA supporters, had gotten permission. They had held rallies in support of Trump, large numbers, both on Capitol Plaza and the U.S. Supreme Court. Many of them were vulgarities, but they had a right to protest and say, we think this is wrong. Trump ought to be elected, this or that. There was no violence, but I can guarantee you, Jeffrey, there was no censorship at all. You could carry a Confederate flag. You could have all sorts of vulgarities about Mr. Biden and otherwise. There was free speech at its best. Capitol Hill Plaza was not Tiananmen Square, Red Square. Free speech. You had your opportunity. You had a right to protest and make your claims. You had a right to go to court, and they went to court, but you lost. That's how the process works. Now, because they're human beings that operate, okay, it's not infallible, but by and large, the Republican community understood in the serving in the electoral process that this was a free and fair election. So the argument that the Trump people didn't have a chance, according to our legal avenues of redress, to have their voice heard is nonsense. I heard it 12, 20 times. I didn't have to agree with it, but that's your right. I walked through it. It didn't really get pushed around, but there's a little bit of jostling, but it was nothing that was violent. And that's what is so disturbing about those who continue to insist, despite having the greatest probably due process in the history of any contested election, saying, no, we don't accept the outcome. I mean, at that point, if you don't accept this outcome, then you don't accept the judicial system. Why should you accept the outcome of any court ruling? Under that theory, Biden could have said, oh, the administration, the Supreme Court issued its ruling on Trump, but the heck with the court. No, I think they got it wrong. I'll just do what I want to do anyway, irrespective of the court ruling. And that's what makes it such a threatening precedent that we have here, where so many are just being unwilling. They could say, well, that's how the process works, even if I disagree with the court in their calculation that there was no fraud. That's the way it is, and the court trumps me. Every individual doesn't have the authority to play U.S. Supreme Court or federal court at all. Totally, I think, lack of comprehension of process being the essence of our democratic dispensation is alarming, to say the least. And I think Mr. Trump doesn't know that either.
Do you think that the delay in the Supreme Court hearing arguments and then the time they took for issuing a ruling, do you think was intentional to let the clock run out so that not only would there not be any trials before the election, there'd be actually no presentation of any evidence prior to the election?
Well, we don't have insight.
I know it's speculation,
but we can at least make inferences, Jeffrey, on the way in which the court has treated past high-profile cases. Right? Perhaps the most analogous is Bush versus Gore, 2000 race. The court decided that this case within days. After argument, within, I think, 48 hours, they accelerated everything because time was of the essence. And in my lifetime, there have been numerous cases in which the court accelerated cases concerning the president. Goes back to the Pentagon Papers. They came back in midsummer, had an emergency hearing, decided President Nixon could prevent the New York Times and Washington Post from publication. We have the Nixon tapes case, decided in less than 3 or 4 weeks after the case had been accepted for review.
And Trump v. Anderson?
Yeah, Trump versus Anderson on the Colorado case, which is also, that was the one holding that Colorado by itself could not decide that Trump had engaged in insurrection and was disqualified in Colorado from appearing as a presidential candidate. And this wasn't an instance where the parties were seeking to slow walk the case. The special counsel, Mr. Smith, he asked, put this on an accelerated calendar, like you've done in so many other cases. They wouldn't do it. And they hold the case to the very last of the term.
Right.
So if you just draw inferences, it's hard to resist, based upon the baseline way in which the court deals with cases concerning a president, that the court was trying to do anything to try to make certain that there was no trial that occurred before November 2024 balloting, which is a political, not a legal calculation.
Is there any, at least from the testimony provided, again, what Trump has the opportunity himself of doing a filing that includes exculpatory evidence, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, which, so to date has not happened.
To date, nothing's been filed. And I can point out, Jeffrey, that in the January 6th committee of the House, Republicans had an opportunity to put whatever witnesses they wanted on the stand to testify about how all the previous witnesses who had incriminated Trump were wrong. Didn't produce not one witness. Even the Trump supporters, if you will, in the Congress refused to testify. So those who claimed massive fraud, they refused to permit themselves to be examined under oath and explain where the fraud was. I don't think there's any there. That's why we're not seeing it.
So we've seen a number of opportunities for actual evidence to be presented to demonstrate fraud. We also saw the fact that Trump, in many of these cases where when he or his agents were on the phone with governors or secretaries of state or other officials of certain states and were repeating claims that he had heard from other third parties, that many of those claims were actually investigated by the states and they were actually refuted. So is that what isn't that part of the document, that when there were specific allegations, it's not like the state said, well, okay, that's nice, we're going to ignore that you said that, but that they were taking seriously when there were specific claims made, they were taking them seriously, they were investigating them, and they got back and they informed him of the results of their investigation. Is that an accurate depiction of what this 165-page document demonstrates?
Yes, it's fortified further because we know that his attorney general, Mr. Barr, told him, we investigated all this, Mr. President. There's nothing there. It's made up out of thin air. After Mr. Barr resigned, then his successors also went over to the White House. And when Trump made these repeated claims, just write letters to the states saying you have evidence of fraud, it's underway, you need to reconsider your electoral vote. They told him, we looked at every one of the allegations you sent over, there's nothing there. These are the actual investigators, not the ones who are sitting in some ivory tower saying, well,
so it was not that there was a refusal to investigate.
Yeah, not a refusal.
They investigated. They told him the results, that there was no there, and his reaction seemed to be indifference. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, you have to find it, or it doesn't matter whether there's fraud. I win anyway. And I want to go back and repeat something, and I apologize if it's tedious here, what I mentioned earlier. Mr. Trump paid over $1 million to two private investigative firms who were supposed to be specializing in electoral fraud to come back with their own results. And both of them came back and said, no, we couldn't find any electoral fraud. These were the investigators that Trump personally selected.
So there are some questions here. One is statistically impossible? Is that not evidence? Well, from my understanding, Trump did hire data scientists, and the data scientists never said this outcome was statistically impossible. So are you aware of any outcome that has been to be statistically impossible, as far as an outcome from this election? So if somebody could prove that some outcome was statistically impossible, would that be considered evidence?
If you had an expert, they could provide expert testimony. They would have to explain, what was their procedure, what were the benchmarks used to decide this was or wasn't statistically impossible. It's not immediately apparent to me what that idea even means, other than to say that I guess it's statistically impossible that you have more votes counted than registered voters. That obviously something's amiss there, but that has never been demonstrated. when Trump made all these claims that you had 4 million more votes counted in Pennsylvania than the registered vote. He just had it wrong. His facts were simply wrong. But yeah, if you can have expert testimony to show that this is just statistically couldn't have happened for some particular reason with regard to matching the votes cast with registered voters and those who had shown that they had moved out of state or something like that. I would add this point, Jeffrey, and that is when you compare Trump's votes as opposed to other Republicans, it wasn't as though that you found any, systemic, if you will, drop off of Republicans. Remember, Republicans regained control of the House in 2020. Trump didn't run as well as the Republicans' running mates. They all had the same ballots. They're all in the same ballots. And that, at least in my judgment, strengthens the conviction Trump lost because he wasn't as popular as some of the other Republican candidates who did win in those same states where he claimed that there was this massive fraud. It seems very improbable that you're going to commit fraud in only one part of the ballot and not others.
Yes. Well, so he hired data scientists. Yes. So I guess the assumption is that he hired data scientists. The data scientists proved that things were statistically impossible, and that's part of the exculpatory evidence. Trump is waiting for a trial to be presented at trial and doesn't want anybody to know exists before the trial. But people who were paid, as you pointed out, selected by him, paid by him, they did work. They basically found no systemic fraud, nothing that would change the outcome of the election. He decided to withhold that information, correct? He did not make that available. He didn't say, oops, I hired people, and this is what they came up with. He basically never changed his story, even though people consistently presenting him information were consistently. Are we aware of any one person that presented evidence, actual evidence to him that he won? Are we aware of any single person that said, here's the evidence to demonstrate I have the smoking gun that demonstrates clearly that there was fraud and I won? And what were the statements made when people were making statements saying he lost? What was his attitude about the statements, people making those type of statements?
Well, I think we have at least a sample, Jeffrey, with the 61 court cases. Now, some of them were dismissed because of standing issues, but I know of in none of those 61 cases did any human being take the witness stand and state under oath, based upon my personal knowledge, this vote was wrongly counted for Biden rather than Trump. Not one. No admissible evidence. Zero. And that's why I think these defamation claims, and you have to prove falsity, have all had real legs to them because there isn't any evidence on the other side. You would think, given the amount of money involved, Fox, they ultimately paid, as you pointed out, I think it's $780 million. If they could actually find somebody, and these, again, the witnesses obviously would be sympathetic to Trump. And unless you're Ichabod Crane, in hibernation, you would know about the lawsuits and you'd volunteer. Hey, here's my evidence. I know on direct evidence.
People would pay a big bounty for it. One is people should want to do it anyway because of their love and affection for this person, but even as a business, it'd be very valuable. I mean, someone would pay a big bounty for this information because it's valuable information, yet nobody seems to have produced it.
Yeah, that's right. And listen, we understand, again, because we're human, it's conceivable that errors were made, but the likelihood diminishes day by day when the opportunity is available. We're now, 4 years almost after 2020 balloting, and there's still nothing. Subpoenas, the information, money. Trump doesn't lack for money to hire people to investigate. He still comes up with nothing. And the virtually everybody in his inner circle who he appointed told him, you lost the election. J.D. Vance, in his private conversation, said he's going to lose the election. And so it would be, almost believing, you could turn straw into gold to suggest, okay, somehow there's going to be some of this evidence that's going to be emerging. And the idea that Mr. Trump, knowing how much it could help him this November, would knowingly withhold from the public exculpatory information defies belief. We know what he cares about is power and himself. It would leak out in some way or other, no matter what his lawyers advised him. And it's still not there.
Well, here's a couple of other questions. Well, one question to ask is, Cannon basically said that Smith essentially has no standing, and so the cases would drop because Smith has no standing to make a case. Now, that's Cannon's ruling with respect to her court. Tanya Chutkan, Judge Chutkan, has her own right to make her own opinion regarding whether Smith has standing or not standing until a higher court opines on that. Is that an act?
Yeah, in fact, it was quite unusual in Judge Cannon's order in the issue concerning Jack Smith being properly appointed or not, and that she says, my order applies only in this courtroom, no place else. Now, it wasn't an argument that was made in the district court before. Judge Cannon was the first one who bought this ever, because the U.S. Supreme Court addressed the same issue basically in a case called U.S. versus Nixon in 1974, when Leon Jaworski was challenged. You have no standing because you're special counsel. You weren't appointed according to any particular statute of Congress, and therefore you can't seek to subpoena Mr. Nixon's tapes. And the court, in a footnote, dismissed it. And because this is not the first time you've had special counsels a long, long way back to try to overcome the conflict of interest when the executive branch is confronting itself. And at least at the outset in the January 6th case here in Washington, Trump's lawyers didn't even make the argument that was made in Florida that he didn't have standing.
So the point is, a higher court has not made an ultimate ruling on whether Smith has standing or not. So essentially, Cannon made a ruling that applied in her courtroom only, and Judge Chutkan is not bound by the ruling Cannon made according to her courtroom. And Cannon used her criteria, and Chutkan has used her own criteria, and they each have the right to apply their own criteria until a higher court makes a definitive ruling that would bound every other court, like the Supreme Court. Is that so? So it hasn't gone through that process. So until it does, if it does, Cannon speaks for her court, and Chutkan speaks for her court. So you can have one ruling. That's what a decentralized process is all about. That it doesn't get to a level that it gets to the supposedly the ultimate law of the land that makes a decision on behalf of everyone else. That's not the case. Cannon made the judgment for her court and her court only, as you already stated. So and she could be wrong, she could be right, and maybe a higher court will make a final ruling on whether Smith has standing or not standing to present the case. We also point out that the fact that that Smith might not have standing doesn't mean that there's not a valid case against Trump. It just means that Smith is not the person that has the right to present that case in front of the court.
Yeah, now, one of the ironies, if I can comment, Jeffrey, about what you've observed, is that under Cannon's ruling, that Merrick Garland, who's a direct appointee of Biden, more politically engaged than Smith, would have the power to go forward in the case. just put his name on instead of Jack Smith's. But you're trying to minimize conflict of interest, and your result is the opposite. And I'd like to add a historical footnote since I was engaged directly. I was at the Justice
Let me just stop
Department.
you there, though. Just one thing. What you're saying is that all that they needed to happen to proceed the case is Garland could have stepped in and signed on behalf of, filed the same filing, and put and erased Smith's name and put his own name on it, and then the case would proceed.
Correct, under her ruling. That's right. And of course, that would, of course, raise even more hackles by Trump. See, it's so obvious. Merrick Garland's appointed by Biden, so he's doing this because he wants to give Biden an advantage in the 2024 race before Mr. Biden dropped out. But I think the audience may profit if I can add a historical footnote. I'm working in the Justice Department at the time when the modern special prosecutor was formed and created by regulation. And this was in 1973. We had two prior attorney generals leave because they had committed crimes, John Mitchell and Richard Kleindienst. And so Elliot Richardson, who was a Republican, he had been nominated by Nixon to be the attorney general to succeed Kleindienst and Mitchell. And it was the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who insisted, we will not confirm you as attorney general unless you create a special prosecutor to investigate Mr. Nixon. Congress insisted upon this. And the reasoning of Judge Cannon was, the executive branch was just taking a fling to evade Congress in creating the special counsel by regulation. Congress said not only did he have to have regulations creating special prosecutors, they said, and you know who that first one's going to be? Archibald Cox. And until Richardson agreed to those conditions and had a charter, they wouldn't confirm him. So the whole phenomenon of special prosecutors is a product of congressional pressure and demand because they could see themselves that there's a huge conflict of interest when an executive branch appointee from the president is investigating the president. Again, a man should not be a judge in his own case.
Right.
And so the idea that the special counsels are somehow an evasion of the congressional prerogative to create these offices is counter-historical. It was created because Congress demanded it of Elliot Richardson. Otherwise, you're not going to be attorney general.
The next question, and please, excellent points, Bruce. Thank you for clarifying all these points. Why do you believe that, if you believe that this is not election interference, the timing under which the timings were not controlled by either Smith or Jutkin. They were a process that they had absolutely no control over it. So I guess some people believe that the public, it seems to me that many of the same people who believe that the public had a right to know about what was in the Hunter Biden files have no right to know about what evidence has been accumulated with respect to potential crimes committed by candidate Trump. So, the same people who thought it was okay to hack or whatever means was used to release the files in Hillary Clinton's emails right prior to the election, that's not election interference, that the Biden files being released right prior to the election was not election interference, but somehow because Trump was able to, delay this long enough that the reward for delaying it long enough should be that that the public has no right to know any of this stuff prior to an election. It seems to me that right now, every voter is going to know what case has been made that has been made against Trump, a case that would have been heard if the Supreme Court didn't put everything on hold before determining whether the extent of immunity, the boundaries of immunity. So they said they put everything on hold while that was being decided, and then they took a long time to decide that, and so that the result of all these dilatory tactics, either done by Trump and Trump's legal team, and then facilitated by the Supreme Court, that the reward should be that the public has no right to know, and that none of this is material to people being informed in determining the character. At the time, of the Hunter Biden files, uh, I was then affiliated with Parler, and I had calls from the media and some people asking me, why do I think that allowing the Hunter Biden files on Parler, was proper, and I gave the same answer all the time. I said that one is Parler's a free speech platform, and so the information's out there, and we're not going to restrict any information flow, and the people can decide the merits or lack of merit of any of the information out there, and that's for the public to decide, not for gatekeepers to decide. And the other thing I said is this also, to the extent that many people might not vote based upon an ideology, but might vote on the perceived character of an individual, and there's an expression that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and to the extent that if they look at Hunter Biden's character and can make a judgment about what can I learn about Joe Biden's character as a result of what I observe about Hunter Biden's character, and I grew up in people hearing people say, the apple doesn't fall far from a tree. That doesn't mean it's an accurate thing, but it's a philosophy many people believe. So, and people have the right to believe, that if you see something about the son, you'll learn something about the father, and if you see something about the father, you'll learn something about the son, and could be true, could not be true, but people have the right to make these judgments about the character of an individual. And so I personally don't believe this is election interference, because I think anything that gives us incremental knowledge is something that is valuable to us, and this is certainly relevant. There's been, because it's a point that you've made, a lot of people are talking about now whether they'll accept the 24 election, and the premise of not accepting the 24 election is the allegations of systemic fraud in 2020. It's so that's what's causing the people to say we don't trust 2024 because we don't trust 2020. So it seems to me that getting out, should we trust 2020, is so important to 2024, because of the allegations of the basis for not trusting 2024 is 2020. It seemed to me that we should get everything out there about 2020 before 2024. So hopefully we can either we can trust 2024, or we have a solid basis for not trusting it. But right now, there's no solid basis for not trusting it. There's innuendo. There's, just a lot of statements made, but nothing that has proven any statistical possibility, impossibility. No evidence whatsoever. Yet many people are out there credibly questioning, or at least it's perceived as credible, the outcome of 2024. And again, I have to reiterate this: all it's because they think 2020 is corrupt. And they think 2020 is corrupt in the absence of any evidence that 2020 is corrupt. So it seems to me it's really crucial that all this get out there, including Trump's ability to have a response to demonstrate that 2020 was corrupt. So, which he's not going to be denied, correct?
That's correct. And remember, Mr. Trump does not lack for money and funds. There are his supporters who are billionaires. They could put on neon signs on New York Times Square. They could have a Goodyear blimp. They could stick this everywhere if there was actual exculpatory evidence. Publicize it to the whole world. They have a right to do that. They don't have any evidence to show. And I think the reason why they are silent is because they know that once they put it in the public domain, like anyone else, like Jack Smith's information is in the public domain, then it's subject to be cross-examined and discredited, even if it's not in a court of law. And they would be asked, okay, well, where's this? Okay, what's your source? Where's the authenticity of this or that evidence? It's just not there. And we know, I believe, that even Trump's closest political Sherpa guys, if you will, and I would put there Roger Stone and Steve Bannon, They have openly said, we announce victory before the polls close. It doesn't matter. Our people will believe we won and will yell fraud. Okay. They are very cynical, and they're playing on this myth to try to corrupt, if you will, the acceptance of the outcome of 2024 election. These are the kinds of people Mr. Trump associates with. It doesn't matter. They believe they truly are revolutionaries. They're not Bolsheviks because they don't, cite Karl Marx, but they're revolutionaries in the sense of because they're willing to throw out the process that we have. It's imperfect as it is. It's so superior to any other. We cast that aside. Don't worry. Our endurance as a shining republic on a hill is over. And then we're back to the law of the jungle where AK-47s rule.
When Trump was informed of Pence's life potentially being at risk, what was the allegations of his comment at that point that he was informed of the potential risk to Pence's life?
Well, when Trump is told by his closest associates, again, this is not somebody whose source he can doubt. Listen, they're chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." They're going after him. He's been now put into a safe, temporary place by the Secret Service for his safety of himself and his family. They're building gallows as well. He retorts, "So what?" He retorts, "So what?" He had total indifference if Mike Pence and his family had to be killed in order for him to steal the 2020 election. I think that casts a lot of light on his character.
So it is a statement about somebody's character. I guess many people think that's presidential character.
Well, I think it's not presidential. It's monarchical character. It's tyrannical character. It's a little bit like Henry II to his associates, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And suddenly Thomas à Becket ends up dead. Okay. And Henry II is happy, right? So it's not presidential character. It's the character of a tyrant.
I don't disagree, but I guess a lot of people do disagree. So that's the attribute they want in a president. I wonder if they manage their families and their work relationships exactly the same way as they want the president to behave. Some comment was made, and I'm not sure what point they was trying to be made. No candidate was as popular as Biden. No candidate ever got 150 million votes or even close. So I think how many votes Biden got might not necessarily reflect how popular Biden was, but maybe might be a greater statement than how unpopular Trump was. Why do people assume that all the people that voted for Biden were necessarily enthusiastic for Biden, that many of them, or maybe even most of them, or a high percentage of them, were enthusiastic about voting against Trump? So if you look at Trump's unpopularity at that point in time, ironically, he's more popular today than he was when he was running in 2020. But when he was running in 2020, his negatives were quite high. They were over 50%, and his positives were, as I recall, which I might recall incorrectly, were usually around 43, 45%. His negatives were over 50%. So I don't know why so many people would find it lacking credibility that many people went to the polls enthusiastically voting against Trump, not enthusiastically voting for Biden.
Yes, I think in some sense, to my mind, Jeffrey, the more important issue is not Trump, Biden as personalities. It's the process.
Right.
The process is everything. The process is our Constitution. Even knowing, as I repeat, it's imperfect, all the others are terrifying. The others are whoever has the power, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. We know what that looks like in the real world because it's a doctrine that applies most of the globe. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. We have a process. As short of perfection as it is, it's the best that's ever been conceived to try to tap in to having our president represent popular consensus and will. We
Yes.
cannot abandon the process because we don't like the outcome. Now, in 2016, I will say I didn't vote for either Trump or Hillary Clinton. If either of them was elected, and Trump was through the Electoral College, although the popular vote went to Hillary Clinton, now I wasn't rejoicing, but listen, I wasn't saying, well, he's not president. If I disagree, I have free speech rights to oppose it. If I agree, I can support him. But the process is critical here. And that is what, to my mind, is so dangerous about 2024 when Trump and J.D. Vance have repeatedly stated they are not going to accept the process after it's all played out if they don't think it made them the winners.
I think I agree completely with you. Whenever people tell me about these Trump trials and all and all the allegations they make, I always say, okay, you don't really like this trial. Tell me, what is the reform of the system you want to propose?
Yeah.
So I mean, clearly you have no proposal to reform the system. You just want to exempt Trump from the system. That's all. So you want to give him blanket immunity, no matter what. So somehow you want Trump to have this special privilege of this blanket immunity because the system works for everyone except maybe conservatives or Trump or whoever you believe that works. For me, I think all the systems are imperfect, but it's our rule of law that I trust more than the political process. So I don't vote because I don't trust the political process at all. So, but that doesn't mean I don't trust the process under which, the politicians are chosen. And to the extent that I do think it's a corrupt process, I think it's not corrupted by the way people think it's corrupted. I think it's corrupted by money, and so I would like to see campaign finance reforms. I'd like to see a lot of reforms. I would like to see a law that basically stipulates that any candidate running for office has to sign a sworn affidavit that every statement they make is true. And while they're a candidate, if they make any false statement, any citizen can sue them for libel or slander or anything. And if they can prove that they've made any false statement, then they are disqualified from ever running for office again. And then you'd start seeing people not lie anymore. If every citizen had the right, have standard of suing any candidate who made a statement that they could then prove was a knowingly false statement. So then we'd see all these claims, about, well, some of them are just speculations, like, we'll never see. I guess everybody should vote now because according to actually maybe all the candidates out there, this could be the last election the country ever has. So I think Musk reiterated that point recently at the rally he spoke at with Trump, that if Trump loses, there'll never be another election in the country. I would like to, I wish, betting big was legal, and I would invite Trump and MAGA people and Musk himself to bet that we will have a subsequent election. If Kamala wins, I don't think that if Kamala wins, this will be the last election, and I would be happy to take that side of the bet with anyone who would be willing to bet with me. A gentleman's bet or something like that. You're generally like skin in the game. So when people make these statements, I come from the world of finance. So for me, everything is noise until it has collateral behind it. And what do I mean by collateral behind it? Is if somebody says something and you prove it's false, there's a consequence associated with it beyond just their loss of reputation. Usually there's money associated with it. That if somebody makes a claim, like if I go do due diligence on a company and they make false statements to me, the fact that I have, liquidated damages, that if I find anything false, that anything they say is collateralized, that if it proves not to be true, they have to give me money. Then the same works for me. If they prove anything that I say is false, I have to give them money. So to me, that's sort of like how I see the world, is that words are noise unless they're collateralized by something. So politicians' words are all noise because they're collateralized by nothing. So they're fiat words. It's like our money, fiat words, collateralized, backed by nothing, and it's all bullshit. So I don't waste my time voting, but I do have reasonable trust for rule of law. So I trust the system. I trust more than any other system is a legacy of the British rule, which is the common law system. So that's my trust is in the common law system among all the other systems. I think there was a great design of checks and balances, to have a limited government, but the government found ways around that, and so we have a Leviathan. We don't have limited government. So I don't believe in the Leviathan. I don't believe in an empire. So I do have reasonable trust, or at least I trust more than anything else, the common law system.
Yeah, I would make this observation, Jeffrey, to add to your observation about money in politics. That I can guarantee you, George Washington didn't spend a farthing, become unanimously elected twice, not one, or whatever they had at the time, not even a continental. But I think the spike in spending is simply a reflection of the Leviathan state. These staggering amounts of money are invested because Congress, the government now, or the executive branch through regulations, controls so much of your wealth. Through regulations, your success or lack of success of your business, that they're looking for a return on investment by having the Congress or regulators interfere with the law of supply and demand in their favor, or build moats around them to deter competition. And that an indirect way to dry up the money is to shrink the government. And perhaps the greatest fuel to the spiraling of the Leviathan state was the income tax amendment, which gave the government so much money that it could bribe all the states to do what it wanted to do, say, here's a grant and aid. So even if we can't do this directly, if you do what we tell you to do, we'll give you the money. And that's where we get back to a government and a nation where our liberty is glory, the right to march to your own drummer. It's not empire, domination, the march of the foot soldier, the thinker over the armored knight. And that's where we need to be headed.
I agree with that. I believe, and I've stated this a number of times, that I say that the nail on the coffin of the end of the constitutional republic occurred in 1913. It was the year we got the income tax. It was the year we got the Fed. And it was the year we got direct election of senators. So I think that 1913 was about the point of time when it was called the progressive era. So we entered the progressive era, and America transformed itself from a free nation state to beginning of emerging towards being an American empire. And the condition precedent to becoming an American empire began in 1913, which significantly changed the incentives when you can tax people, when you can print fiat money, and you can nationalize senatorial elections that would then dilute state rights. So I say that the end of our republic that had been diminishing over time anyway, but to me the nail on the coffin was 1913. So
Yeah.
it's one comment somebody said, and I will conclude this: never trust someone who pays more to get a job than the job pays.
Yeah, that's a good jingle. I just add this, Jeffrey, that the fourth element that you omitted in 1913, that's when Woodrow Wilson became president. He's the first time ever a president referred to democracy, not checks and balances, as the earmark of our country. Had no president, you go back to Federalist Papers, no president ever used the word democracy except in a pejorative way. And Mr. Wilson believed in all the opposite of checks and balances. He said, I'm really a smart guy. I teach at Princeton. All the technocrats know everything. way better than the American people do. So we just need to bring them into the paradise and the promised land. His book called Congressional Government, he denounced checks and balances. Why are you preventing the government from doing all these wonderful things? If we can make the waves go back, we can turn straw into gold. We need to get rid of that. And remember, he's the one who enters the White House and proceeds now with the income tax and the Fed, and the end of the the indirect election of senators to then lead us into the, out of our paradise and into dystopia.
Yes. Well said, Bruce. Well, thank you so much again. As always, it's a stimulating conversation with you. Always, and I hope everyone who listened also agrees. And thank you so much again, Bruce.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for everyone listening in or watching as well.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.